What's up, Sixers fans? This is the Sixers Talk podcast presented to you by Wilmington University. William Works. I'm Ben Berry. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at I am Ben Berry. He's the one, the only, the great Noah Levick. Noah, how you doing today?
Hey Ben, I'm doing okay. I think everyone in the Philadelphia area is doing better than the Sixers played last night. So yeah, we will break that game down and have as good a time as we can with it. But yeah, it's a bit jarring what happened last night. I'm not sure anyone could have predicted that coming. First loss of the James Harden era, or first loss with him on the court, and it was a brutal one. I mean, I don't think it's hyperbolic to say that was the Sixers' worst loss of the season, even if it wasn't technically by margin of defeat. But
the feeling overall from it, yeah. So we're going to get into that. Follow Noah Levick at Noah Levick on Twitter. We're going to get into just the overall play of the team, the loss, James Harden's performance, and the rumblings again about him in big game scenarios. Ben Simmons being back on the court. Also, their upcoming matchups, the doubleheader against the Magic and against the Denver Nuggets. Last night's game was bad. It was brutal. It was ugly to look at. I'm competing in the CrossFit Open. I hope the final workout is better than that Sixers game against the Nets, because the fans went from booing Ben Simmons to booing the Sixers within a couple of hours. And this was the trade that that Daryl Morey wanted for James Harden. It was a month from the trade happening to Ben Simmons coming back and these teams playing each other for the first time. It's still a possibility that these two teams can see each other in the playoffs. And it's not doom and gloom. It's not the end of the world. But every Sixers fan wanted a win, and they wanted to win with Ben Simmons sitting there watching, and it just did not happen.
Right. I think everything that could possibly have went wrong just about went wrong in this game. I think the only major positive you can point to is Joel Embiid drew 19 first-half free throws and had former teammate Andre Drummond in foul trouble, and Bruce Brown and Kyrie Irving also dealt with fouls in the first half. But everything else was catastrophic. I don't think that's an exaggeration. Kevin Durant hit everything he took over Tobias Harris. Kyrie Irving was Kyrie Irving, and Seth Curry convincingly was the better player in the matchup against Kyrie's Maxey. And for me, this was the first game in a long, long time where I thought Maxey looked like a 21-year-old player facing stars who have been in the league for a lot longer than him and accomplished a lot more than he has. Some of these fundamental mistakes that are just not characteristic of his relatively mature game, you saw those last night with him biting on pump fakes and giving Curry too much space, and he did not have his typical offensive confidence either. Airballed a couple of jumpers, ends up with a season-low 4 points. But, of course, the understandable headliner is James Harden. I mean, you can't do much worse than 3 for 17 from the floor. He did have the milestone checked off early in the game where he passed Reggie Miller for third on the all-time three-point list. But then every other shot he put up pretty much did not go in. And it was an inevitable storyline last night that his attempts to draw fouls and cleverly, put his arm against someone else's wrist, or, some of the little quote unquote dirty tricks of the trade that he's become so good at, they just were severely ineffective. He only took 2 free throws in this game, and also did not improve his teammates in the ways he had over his first 5 games as a Sixer. Matisse Thybulle was poor offensively, committed a really bad turnover. There was a momentum swinger where he for whatever reason, tried to like fling the ball to Maxey in the backcourt, and it ended up with an Irving three. So it truly felt like the sky was falling by like halftime of that game. And it is just one regular season game. So only counts as one loss. That's the way the Sixers have to look at it. And I think the way Harden described it afterwards is appropriate. He said they got their ass kicked. No arguing with that. And he also said he thinks it's good for the team and it brings them down to reality. And now we'll see what they learn from this game and whether they're able to ensure that something similar does not happen again anytime soon.
Start college, build skills, and complete your degree with Wilmington University. 100% online options and affordable tuition makes WilMU work for you. Learn more at wilmu.edu. You said so many right things. Actually, none of it was wrong. I think for me, watching the game, I knew I was done when Kyrie Irving blocked Tobias Harris's shot. I was like, this is not going to be it. And the facial expression you just made, it says it all. When that happened, I knew we were in for a long night. Back to James Harden. And let's start off with the team first. And not doom and gloom, but on the previous podcast with Danny, you said that this team still had some shortcomings that other teams would expose sooner or later. For me, one of those shortcomings is just the shooting. If Joel Embiid doesn't have it, if James Harden doesn't have it, it's glaring that this team just cannot make enough shots. That was one of the things that showed up last night. Was there anything else that showed up for you?
Right. I think the other major one is just lack of above average defenders. Joel Embiid and Matisse Thybulle, of course, were deserving all defensive team selections last year, and you figure they'll again be in that conversation. But it is rough outside of those two, especially with Danny Green's sideline. Obviously, that Green being out with this finger laceration is not the reason the Sixers lost by 29 points, but it is glaring just how many weak spots the Sixers have on that end of the floor. And of course, last night we saw the worst version of Maxey, and we saw the Sixers be so vulnerable in transition defense because they were committing these rushed, careless, not intelligent turnovers. Turned the ball over 20 times last night, and many of those early in the game were just immediately fueling layups and Kyrie pull-up three-pointers and situations where the Nets could show off their considerable offensive talents in the open floor. But I do think defensively overall, this team has real concerns, and the offensive firepower is not always going to be sufficient to overcome those issues. And I think relatedly, you just see last night, there is a lack of depth. Again, Green's out, and that's notable, but Doc Rivers only goes with an 8-man rotation, and none of those three players off the bench do anything super positive. Niang hits a couple of shots, but by that point, it's garbage time. Shake Milton, I think, was 0 for 6, which is not great when you're seeking shooting outside of your two main stars. And the Sixers just don't seem like a team that has a great plan B or plan C when James Harden is struggling the way he was last night. And of course, 3 for 17 is extreme, and you doubt that he'll replicate that, but it is nice to feel like you're not dependent on him being efficient and setting up teammates and conducting the offense. And I think it did feel that way last night. And Brooklyn made the Sixers look especially bad by playing aggressively and playing more physically and just out-hustling them in a lot of situations. And of course, all your weaknesses are going to be magnified when that's the case.
Without a doubt. Now, to James Harden's 3 for 17 night. On the TNT postgame show last night, on Zach Lowe's podcast, I've heard it before. I've heard it for years. We've all heard it, that James Harden doesn't show up big in big games. And a conversation I had with some friends a couple weeks ago was, what is James Harden like playoff defining moment? And we struggled to come up with one. And I'm not trying to be doom and gloom guy, be super negative, but the reputation is there, big games. Maybe you might want to debate what is considered a big game and what isn't. But when you go to those Western Conference Finals, the Rockets were up 3-2 on the Warriors. Chris Paul got hurt. And I know it was one of the most inexplicable performances ever that Houston missed 27 straight threes, but James Harden was the star. He was the leader on that team. He was the star player. He's looked tired before in the playoffs. Outside of 2012, a big shot against the Spurs to send OKC to the finals, I can't think of many opportunities of James Harden playing outstanding in a big game when it's close, when it's 2-2, or his team is down 3-1. It's either they're up 3-1 or they're down 1-3 in the playoffs. Regular season is different type of basketball than playoffs. Everyone would agree with that. I don't want to succumb to that theory that he doesn't play big in big games, but the evidence is there. And it just, after last night, it doesn't sit well, where that's something I have to think about, or maybe Sixers fans have to think about come the playoffs.
Agreed. That's not at all an encouraging performance on that front. Yeah, I think, honestly, if I had to pick what's the defining game thus far of James Harden's postseason career, it is that 27 straight missed threes game, just because it's so emblematic of all the what ifs with that Rockets era, where Harden was a leading scorer, an MVP player, an offensive genius, but his teams did not reach the finals, in part through underperformance in important moments, and in part through terrible luck. Because, of course, that's going to be part of the equation when you miss 27 straight threes, or an outlandish number like that. But yeah, I don't think we want to blow last night up to be more than it is, as far as that being the biggest game in the world, even though, of course, it felt more important than a typical regular season game. But I do think it's fair to note that Harden, who is known for his efficiency and his ability to draw fouls and get up and make a ton of threes in the regular season, does not carry over those same qualities to that same elite level in the playoffs historically. And the hope, of course, with the Sixers is he's able to be an optimal offensive player next to an all-star in Joel Embiid, and that they'll make life easier for each other. But I do think it's fair to wonder, especially now that he's 32 years old and he's had recent hamstring issues, including last postseason, what exactly the Sixers can expect from him as far as his postseason performance. Again, I just think it's highly unlikely that anything similar to last night is the norm, but I do think figuring that Harden will be less efficient in the playoffs, and that re-injury risk is real, and that there are some valid reasons to be worried there. I think all of that is legitimate.
You know, watching last night's game and watching Kyrie Irving pick up James Harden, and they both downplayed the reported beef between the two, whether there was that report that Kyrie called him washed in the practice and things like that. And they just said it was like a communication thing. James thought just around guys that wanted to win, all about basketball. Man, Kyrie showed he came to play yesterday, and I don't know if there was really anything there, but when he guarded James Harden, I've never seen Kyrie Irving play defense like that, to my knowledge. Have you?
I'm sure we could find a game where he was also very impressive defensively, but yeah, he was really good. And I think just the Nets overall on Harden, they swarmed him, and they frustrated him very early in that game. Now, part of that is the Sixers shooting themselves in the foot a bunch with these turnovers that created transition offense, and the Sixers defense conceding a lot of early easy points. But boy, it felt like by late in the first quarter, Harden was seeking fouls, wasn't getting whistles, and didn't really know what to do. And I think that was a little bit alarming. But I think the Nets overall were amped up for that game and didn't love the treatment that Ben Simmons was getting, even if they were fully aware that Philly fans would boo heartily and let Simmons know how they felt about his departure. I think the Nets felt somewhat unified and galvanized by that situation, where it's a weird scene and their teammate is in the spotlight, and they want to remind people, even without Simmons on the floor, we're a great offensive team, and put it in the back of the Sixers' minds that if this does become a playoff matchup, they are a formidable opponent for the Sixers, and I think they proved that last night. I don't take last night's game to mean that the Sixers have no chance if there's a playoff meeting between these teams, or that the Sixers' flaws are inherently fatal. But I do think Brooklyn reminded a lot of people that this stretch where they lost 17 to 20 games, a lot of that's just lack of availability and new pieces having trouble gelling. And part of it also is that the Nets are not usually as good defensively as they were last night.
Right.
And the Sixers didn't exploit the Nets' weaknesses on that end of the floor as well. Tyrese Maxey only scoring 4 points, and you watch some of these other games against East opponents like the Bucks or the Celtics, those teams make it a point of emphasis to try to target Curry, as Sixers fans know well. He's a natural defensive target. So the Sixers did not hurt the Nets in ways that they potentially could have, and they sure hurt themselves a lot with the way they played against a motivated, aggressive team that has a lot of talent.
A lot of talent. And you brought up the playoffs, and it's one game. Let's write it off as one game, not all doom and gloom. But the Sixers are currently ranked third in the East. Heat 1, Bucks 2, Sixers 3. The Nets are in the 8th seed. I think they definitely will move up, but looking at the rankings and how everything plays out, I guess I have two questions for you. To go to the finals, chances are they will cross paths, most likely. Would you rather that happen sooner or later, like round 1 or 2 or 3? And also, is it having the 1 seed actually the best case scenario if you're in the Eastern Conference?
I've thought for a while that seedings are a little quote unquote overrated, and in the sense that playoffs are just about matchups. It's about which teams you can exploit the weaknesses of, and which opponents are not equipped to do that well with you. So I think with the Nets, that would be a tough draw in the first round. I think the Sixers, in all likelihood, would prefer facing Brooklyn later down the road. Again, I don't think they're intimidated or terrified by this team, but I think there's a high level of unknown with the Nets, even to a greater extent than many of these other teams like the Bulls or the Heat that have dealt with significant injuries, because there's the Ben Simmons factor, right? He didn't play in last night's game, and by all accounts, the indication is that he will be back on a basketball court somewhat soon. And the hope on Brooklyn's end is that he enhances their defense and takes some stuff off the plate of their star players defensively and sets those guys up in transition and all the things that Sixers fans know he does well. And then the flip side of that, of course, is what is he going to bring to the table offensively? Will he be a liability late in games? What will his free throw percentage be? So there are a lot of variables there, and I think just a lot of reasons to be worried about the Nets in general as a playoff opponent. But I think I've said this before, like looking at the East, I see a lot of teams that could make deep runs, and I also see teams with a lot of flaws. And I think the Sixers are broadly under that same umbrella. The Celtics have been awesome over the last 3-4 months. And it looks like they're perhaps not going to have home court advantage in the first round, or they'll have to raise their seeding to get there. So a lot of uncertainty here, a lot of potentially difficult matchups, but I don't think it is just an overreaction to last night's game to say that you probably would prefer not to face the Brooklyn Nets in the first round of the playoffs.
I agree with that. Ideally, I'm thinking wait second or third round. But as far as having a 1 seed and everything you just said, it's a gauntlet in the Eastern Conference. Heat, Bucks, 1, 2, Sixers, Bulls, Celtics, Cavs, Raptors, Nets. I'm thinking if whatever team makes it out of the East, ideally, or for any team, ideally, it's not like if you're the Sixers, you want to play the Bucks, the Heat, and the Nets, or the Bulls, the Bucks, and the Nets. Like those three, I'm not saying the Sixers. I firmly believe the Sixers can beat any of those teams in the 7-game series. I also know it won't be easy, and chances are you don't want to play a 7-game series in round 1 and another 7-game series in round 2. While whoever you might meet in the Eastern Conference Finals might have played a 4 and a 5-game series when you got extra mileage, loads higher, and they had time to rest. It'll just be a gauntlet in the East. So I don't think necessarily having the first number 1 overall seed is the best. You might have a good chance to play the Nets. So I'm leaning towards not because the Sixers are the 3 seed. It just seems like ideally how everything is positioned and could play out, it is the road of least resistance, in my opinion.
Right. I think the theory that some folks have that regular season tests are a good thing and that you want to be challenged, that all goes out the window in the playoffs. You want every series to be as easy as it possibly can be, especially when you have a player like Joel Embiid, who is a very big guy who's had injuries in his previous postseasons. I think overall, the Bulls and the Cavs, at this point, the Sixers should feel good about how they match up against those teams. They swept the season series against the Bulls, and I believe are up 2-0 currently on Cleveland with 2 road games to come against the Cavs. And Joel Embiid has been especially dominant against those clubs, and I think just the Sixers should feel decent if that's ends up being one of the playoff opponents. But every one of these teams is formidable, and every one of these teams is beatable. And the bottom line also, to state the obvious, is the Sixers won't be going very far if performances like last night are common. They have to weed those out of their game and try to consistently find what works with James Harden in the fold. And that had been going better than anyone could have imagined up until this point, 5-0, averaging 125 points per game with Harden in the lineup. And then last night went worse than anyone could have possibly foreseen. So here we are. They're 40-25. They're third in the East, 5-1 with Harden. None of those are bad things, but last night it is difficult to overstate how bad of a loss that was. And it's incumbent on them to bounce back from that. And, pre-Harden, they'd done that, I think, extraordinarily well this season. Just look back at the schedule, and there are so many instances where they suffered one of these demoralizing losses. Like they get blown out at home by Utah, and then the next game they beat Golden State. The 48-point loss to the Celtics. The game after that, they go on the road and they beat Milwaukee. So the team has demonstrated the ability to bounce back and be resilient and all this good stuff. And now that is very much tested now with James Harden in the mix.
All right, that game's behind us. Move on. Let's have a great weekend. Sixers have a back-to-back coming up. Sunday and Monday. Sunday, the Orlando Magic. Monday, Denver Nuggets. What would you like to see from the Sixers just to prove they are bounced back from that game and how they match up against both teams?
Right. I think just executing the basics early on against Orlando and not falling into a big hole, that's priority number one. There's been this recent trend where they start games without a lot of precision or focus, and it's time to nip that in the bud against an inferior opponent. Orlando has 17 wins, and they're last in the Eastern Conference. The Magic have played the Sixers tough this season. Some of the final margins of these games have been a little deceiving. The Magic have held significant second-half leads and made the Sixers work for their victories. But, yeah, you've got to beat the Orlando Magic and get back on track a little bit here. And, yeah, we'll expected to see Markelle Fultz, who's made his return. So that will be interesting. Last night we did not get to see a former Sixers number one pick take the floor, but Markelle Fultz should be out there. So that'll be nice to see. And then Monday, of course, is the marquee Jokic versus Embiid matchup that we've all been waiting on for a long time. Health permitting, of course, but that will be entertaining, hopefully, and one that many folks will be watching in the context of the MVP race. Jokic has not declined at all in the second half of the season. He's regularly posting like 40-point triple-doubles and single-handedly carrying Denver to wins. And if Embiid can beat him head-to-head and do so impressively, I'm sure voters will take notice of that. So that matchup will perhaps be a lot of fun if it goes the Sixers' way and both big men are on the floor and at their best.
That Nuggets-Sixers matchup got last year's MVP versus our MVP, Joel Embiid, who we all hope wins it this year. Pivotal for that MVP argument conversation going forward. What's impressive about the Joker is he's doing all this with Murray and Michael Porter Jr. out for practically all season. Maybe Michael Porter Jr. played a few games. Don't think so, though. A few, yeah, early on.
Well, that's right. Yeah, but he's dealt with a decimated roster and a lot of weak spots on that supporting cast. And he's, you talk about Harden in his early days here, elevating his teammates in extraordinary ways. Obviously, I think Jokic is the utmost example of that, where if you're on the floor with him, like, you're going to look like a good basketball player because he is so smart and so creative. And just when I watch him, what I think strikes me most is like he always has a solution. And I think I feel similarly about Joel Embiid, but oftentimes with Embiid, that solution is just drawing free throws, either through power or guile or whatever. And with Jokic, of course, there are a myriad of answers he has for whatever defense throws him. So he remains, of course, a top MVP contender, deservedly. And it does feel like the quote-unquote narrative is like shifting in Embiid's fashion. I guess if you look at the odds, he remains favored in that race. But I think most likely the Sixers have to keep winning, and Embiid has to continue doing well in matchups where everyone's watching, as they will be Monday night.
No, before we get out of here, what are you working on over at the website at NBCSportsPhiladelphia.com?
Yeah, so we had our observations off last night's game, and then right before this podcast, just published a story on the outlook for a team after, in Harden's words, they got their ass kicked. Just looking back a little at how the Sixers have responded in similar situations, and the notion that losing in such atrocious fashion is not inherently a horrible thing, but the Sixers obviously have to right the ship here. So got a story on that. And then team will be practicing tomorrow, I assume. So we'll be covering that. And then we'll be sort of shifting gears into that back-to-back that we just talked about. So yeah, the schedule does not stop. The Sixers keep rolling. And I think that's the positive of losing this kind of game in the regular season. It's one regular season game. It's not that costly in the big picture. And there's another game on your schedule soon enough. And for the Sixers, it's against a team that only has 17 wins. So they better win that basketball game Sunday night in Orlando.
Well, Noah, thanks for joining the Sixers Talk podcast. It's always fun catching up, man. Enjoy your weekend. It's supposed to be nice, I believe. Sixers fans, this is Sixers Talk podcast presented to you by Wilmington University. Wilmu works. He's Noah Levick. Follow him on Twitter at Noah Levick. I'm Ben Berry. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at I am Ben Berry. We'll catch you next time.